he's confronted by the consequences of his misrule. What's happening in Kursk and in Ukraine is a consequence of his decision to invade and to weaken his army, and also to point the incompetence and to allow the infighting which goes on inside the system. So he's desperate, as our former Prime Minister might have said, to take back control. I think that's what it was all about on Monday. He's now must deal with this immediately. That's what I think he will do, an incursion. As you said, he's battered, he's bruised, but I don't think he's defeated. I think we should expect more war.
Plenty in Keir Starmer's Red Box this week, as well as notes about how much pain the rail drivers will cost. There's bound to be something about Ukraine's attempts to take the war to Vladimir Putin. The Times this morning reports that the Ministry of Defence has confirmed that UK weapons can be used on Russian soil. You might think that they don't have much choice as it's already happening. Let's get an insight into what is going on in the MOD and the Foreign Office. John Foreman is a former British defence attaché to Moscow and Kyiv. We can speak to him now. Good morning, John.
Morning, Stick.
Was there originally nerves? I remember we spoke to James Heapy about maybe a year and a half ago when he was in government, and he said he actually was quite comfortable with Ukrainians using British ordnance against Russians in Russia. But he was kind of slapped down after saying that. And it was saying, well, no, we're not going that far. This has been a war of increments when it comes to British support. Are you surprised we've got here this quickly, or should we have got here sooner?
No, I think the policy of the British government has actually been pretty consistent for the last 2.5 years. I remember when we were in meetings with Shoigu and Gerasimov in Moscow before the invasion, they were complaining about us providing weapons, NLAWs, anti-tank weapons and self-defense weapons to help Ukraine defend itself. And the Russians complained about that. And I think there has been a sort of gradual process of clarification of what weapons can be used where. I mean, Ukraine has an inherent right of self-defense. That includes the action it's taking inside Kursk. I think there's a big difference between the sort of tactical weapons which Ukraine is using on the ground, shorter range stuff, and also between that and Storm Shadow, which I don't think the government has changed its position on, despite some rumours after the election.
Yeah, but that's an interesting point, because I remember the rows was about giving them planes, and it was always okay to give them guns, but you can't give them planes. And that does seem now, as we get into the third year of the war, was that a distinction without a difference? Was that the right thing to do, or could we have actually been bolder quicker? Maybe we'd have had a shorter war as a result of it.
I think we should be bold in 2022, definitely. I think there was a sort of great reluctance by some of our European partners in America about risk of, quote, escalation. And many politicians, not in the UK, I would say, deterred themselves. They listened to what Putin was saying, and they constrained themselves by not wishing to be seen to be escalatory. So we had this debate about jets. We've had a debate about long-range weapons. We had a debate about tanks. I always remember the maxim of the old First Sea Lord, where he said that moderation in war is imbecility. The essence of war is violence. Yeah. We can't ask Ukraine to defend itself with one or two hands tied behind its back. And I think that Ukraine should have the right to use long-range weapons, missiles against key military targets inside of Russia. But that's the position of the United States, and I don't think that position is going to change anytime soon.
Because the argument is we've already wound up Putin by supporting Ukraine. Ukraine is already in an all-out war with Putin. I guess it's the ghost of tactical nuclear weapons. Is that the thing? Is that the thing on people's minds, that you can push Putin very far but not too far? Is that still the thinking in Washington and even in London?
I think the nuclear argument is always thrown out there. Russia knows what it's doing when it throws a nuclear threat at us. Did a big nuclear exercise before the invasion to warn the West not to get involved directly in the war. That seems to have worked. So we had this large tactical nuclear exercise recently in 2 or 3 phases, which again is reported that Russia's about to use nuclear weapons. I think Russia is not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I think that is all to do with threatening, is just to try and situate us and get us to constrain ourselves. Russia knows that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would have catastrophic consequences on its support from India and China and others around the world.
Yeah. Just finally, how bad is this for Putin? There was the whole Prigozhin thing, and that looked like it was bad for him, and then he stamped down on that. Ukrainians, getting some degree of movement into Russia. Russia having to build trenches in their own country to defend themselves against Ukraine. First invasion since 1941. How bad is this for Putin, do you think?
Well, I obviously was shocked. To take a heartstone not to laugh at him. His predicament on Monday when he was ranting and raving against his subordinates for having let him down. But of course, he's confronted by the consequences of his misrule. What's happening in Kursk in Ukraine is a consequence of his decision to invade and to weaken his army, and also to point the incompetence and to allow the infighting which goes on inside the system. So he's desperate, as our former Prime Minister might have said, to take back control. I think that's what it was all about on Monday. He's now must deal with this immediately. That's what I think he will do, an incursion. As you said, he's battered, he's bruised, but I don't think he's defeated. I think we should expect more war, no peace. I think he's demonstrated over the last 25 years that he can adapt and demonstrate resilience. Yeah. We've been through a whole series of disasters, not just Prigozhin and the loss of the Moscow bar and the consequences of waiting to take Kiev in 3 days, but Beslan and the original Kursk disaster. He's actually managed to come out of it. But I think this will be a test of him. And of course, what the elites in Moscow are looking at are saying, has the man still got it in him to sort out the problem which he's created?
Yeah, he manages to cling on through most things, doesn't he? John, really
he's a great survivor, yeah.
He is indeed. John, really interesting stuff from you.
When this incursion first started, I looked in a degree of horror initially, because there were loads of people saying, this is a reckless act. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to go and risk themselves. But actually, on reflection, I think this is a masterstroke. Warfare is all about momentum. It's about initiative. And my goodness, did President Zelensky catch everybody by surprise, not only the West, but also President Putin. And what's pretty evident as this has gone on, initially we understood it was 1,000 soldiers, 20 tanks, that sort of thing. But it's pretty obvious that they've met minimal resistance and they've just carried on pushing. And therefore, it's almost certainly a much bigger force these days.
Let's start with Ukraine. And President Zelensky says Ukraine is going deeper into Russia. Moscow has declared a state of emergency in the border region of Belgorod. Well, Ukraine says it's planning evacuation corridors for civilians in Kursk as the incursion into Russian territory continues. We're day 9 now. In a video call to President Zelensky, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces say they're now in control of 74 Russian settlements.
Our defence forces continue their offensive on the territory of the Kursk region. Since the start of today, troops have advanced 1 to 2 kilometres in various directions. The search and destruction of the enemy in the settlement of Sudza has been completed. Since the beginning of today, we've taken captive about 100 enemy soldiers.
In response to the incursion, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson published this video explaining what Ukraine could expect in terms of consequence.
With their terrorist actions in the Kursk area, Ukraine has, at minimum, put the peace talks on pause for a long time. In my opinion, they did this intentionally. Peace talks with an absolutely inadequate enemy are unnatural.
Well, in the studio with me now is the military analyst Sean Bell. Sean, very good evening to you.
Good evening, Rosie.
The Russian Foreign Ministry then saying their enemy is inadequate, but Zelensky's proven quite the opposite over the last nine days.
He has, yes. I'd have to say, when this incursion first started, I looked in a degree of horror initially, because there were loads of people saying, this is a reckless act. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to go and risk themselves. But actually, on reflection, I think this is a masterstroke. Warfare is all about momentum. It's about initiative. And my goodness, did President Zelensky catch everybody by surprise, not only the West, but also President Putin. And what's pretty evident as this has gone on, initially we understood it was 1,000 soldiers, 20 tanks, that sort of thing. But it's pretty obvious that they've met minimal resistance and they've just carried on pushing. And therefore, it's almost certainly a much bigger force these days. I think the question is, why are they doing it? I think there's probably 3 reasons, one of which seize the initiative. It's been a really difficult summer because Russia's been on the front foot. Secondly, it demonstrates Russia is not in total control, that Ukraine has a voice in all this. And thirdly, probably most importantly, just imagine the morale, the impact on morale for Ukrainian forces taking the fight to President Putin. I think that's really powerful.
Which continues today. I mean, since we last spoke in this studio in the last 24 hours, Ukraine have taken another 40 square kilometres. I mean, that's no mean feat.
No, and one of the difficulties of learning what's actually going on is that very few of the world leaders are talking much about it. There's lots of security and secrecy. Russia's saying one thing, Ukraine is saying another. And, President Biden's even saying, I don't want to actually talk about the details. It's quite difficult to work out exactly what's happened. But in context, the last time Russian soil was invaded was 1941, Operation Barbarossa. The number one priority of President Putin, he's seen as the man of security, is to protect his people. Suddenly now, people are marching into Russian territory. And although President Putin controls the narrative in Russia, I'm sure people are going to start to hear that his country has now been invaded. And it does sound as if there are a lot of prisoners of war being taken and a lot of people evacuating the area as well.
Yeah, kind of 120,000 at least evacuated. This is the conversation that President Zelensky wanted us to be having last summer. Do you know, that much heralded summer offensive that failed to gain traction? Is this also partly Zelensky saying to Western allies, you thought we couldn't make grounds on land, and actually we can, we've proven ourselves?
I think, yes, I can understand the analogy, but if you go back to September 22, one thing that Zelensky's forces did very well is liberate the Kharkiv region, took 12,000 square kilometres almost overnight. And on the back of that, they said, we can do the spring offensive. The trouble is, Russia heard that and had 6 months to prepare.
Yeah.
And therefore, there were layers of dragon's teeth, trench lines, minefields that meant it almost impossible for Ukraine. I think what nobody expected was that the Ukrainians would do an invasion of Russia. And it's worth the context. There's an enormous border between Russia and Ukraine. If Ukraine can do it there at the moment in the sort of Kursk region, Bryansk and Belgorod are also potentially under threat, they could do it anywhere. And if Russia's going to protect its borders, it's going to have to pull a lot of forces away from the front line. And strategically, I suspect that's ultimately the aim of Ukraine, is to actually force Russia
to redeploy.
To redeploy, because the first forces that were there are some conscripts and local people. They've clearly not put up any defence at all. Ukrainians just walked through. So I think the next question will be, how long will Ukraine stay there? Because Putin will be angry, will want his commanders to deal with this ruthlessly. And bluntly, Ukraine will not want to lose a lot of people as part of that. So it'll be interesting to see how long they stay, what Russia actually does in response, away from the rhetoric, and then how do they manage to extricate themselves, minimising the casualties.
Yeah, we've just heard some of the rhetoric there, haven't we? And right now, you talk about momentum, you've got Ukrainians ripping down Russian flags in towns, in villages, 74 of those territories now. Some of the confusion has been, why hasn't Russia been able to quash this and quash it sooner? We're talking day 9 now.
Well, first of all, I don't think they were ready for it at all, which is a bit of a intelligence failure. Secondly, it is quite an audacious act to do it. And bluntly, Russia's pulled all its military capability into the Donbass region. That's where they're doing the majority of their fighting. And I think this is a masterstroke. What's really interesting from my perspective is these operations only happen when they're intelligence-led. And a lot of intelligence comes to Ukraine from the West, whether it's satellite technology, whether it's the eyes and the ears over the battlefield. All of that will have informed Ukraine where to go. One of the things about morale, though, is fascinating. I know a couple of Ukrainians who I sound check with it every now and again. Yesterday, one of the Ukrainians said to me, we can't wait for a Ukrainian flag to be plonked into the middle of Moscow. And I looked and went, well, that's a bit fanciful, but it just demonstrates the huge morale fill-up. This has been it would be hard to underestimate just how difficult it's been. There's been literally tens of thousands of casualties. Russia has been steadily taking ground, capitalising on the shortage of Ukrainian weapons. Now, Ukraine has seized the initiative, and it'll be really interesting to see what President Putin does about it.
Well, let's try and get into that, because Putin's previously said using NATO weapons on Russian territory was a red line. He often uses that phrase, a red line. What are they, and what's he threatened to do if one of those lines is crossed?
Well, he's consistently had red lines, hasn't he? And if you look back, the West initially was reluctant to help Ukraine for fear of getting NATO involved. Then we provided anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, defensive weapons. And there was a lot of talk, remember, teeth-sucking about providing tanks. The UK led forward onto the Challenger 2. Then there was talk about long-range missiles, Storm Shadow, ATACMS. All of those have gradually come in. F-16s have just arrived in as well. Each time a ratcheting up, each time President Putin rattling the sabre, the nuclear sabre. I think the most interesting one here, though, is that Putin has always suggested that if Russian territory was threatened, that will be a red line. What this bluff has been called now, because the irony that Russia has launched a massive invasion into Ukraine, which it claimed was just liberating towns and villages, led to millions of people relocating, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and a complete devastation of communities. Putin now describes this as a terrorist act by Ukraine because he doesn't want to put Russia on a war footing. He doesn't want that bluff called. He's got himself in a bit of a corner, and I suspect this will be a ruthless reaction against Ukraine once they get the troops redeployed.
And that's what Ukraine will be bracing themselves for. Sean, thank you so much, providing just fascinating context into what's going on and that really audacious attempt from President Zelensky. So far, the gamble's certainly paying off. Sean Bell,